Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. For those of you who are new here, hi, I'm Ariel and I like animals. With that being said, we're just going to jump right into this video. For today's video, I am going to be rating all of my animals. I actually have quite a few animals. If you didn't know, I do have a pet room tour that I just recently filmed. If you want to take a look at that and see the animals that I do have currently. And if you don't care and you just want to see this video, that's great too. For this video, I'm going to be rating each animal that I own, minus my cats and my dog, and just giving them ratings in 4 different categories. I just want to preface this video by saying this is just my personal opinion and from my personal experience. Everyone has different animals, therefore everyone's experience is going to be different, but from what I have experienced in my pet keeping, this is how I feel in regards to these specific species, and maybe this can help you decide whether or not you want to get one or more of these species, if it's the right fit for you. So, with that being said, let's jump into it. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and start with fish. There is a lot of common misconceptions when it comes to fish, and people seem to believe that they can buy their 5-year-old a fish and put it in a bowl and all is well. But for most of us, we know that that's really not the case. So I'm rating all of these animals in 4 categories. The first one being handleability, how easy are they to hold, costs, overall care and maintenance, and how much I would recommend them for beginners. With that being said, let's get into fish. So I'm going to be specifically talking about freshwater fish, and even more specific, tropical fish, and that's going to be like just tropical community fish, schooling fish, and betta fish. So betta care and regular tropical community fish care are a little bit different. So I'm going to rate bettas in the overall care and maintenance a little bit differently than I would for my other 40-gallon tropical tank, but we'll get to that. Anyway, for the first category, we're going to be talking about handleability, and fish are obviously a 0 out of 5. You cannot hold your fish. Sorry. Okay, the second category is going to be costs, and this is just the cost as far as the getting it started up and then, you know, maintenance and care over a time period. I rated them a 3.7 out of 5. That might seem a little bit low because I know a lot of people like to believe that if fish are pretty cheap, you can get a fish for pretty inexpensive. And while this is true, if you're doing the bare minimum and less, fish can be really inexpensive, but if you're doing it correctly, you're caring for them the way that you should be, they can get pretty expensive, you know, with the tank itself, all of the equipment needed. Fish themselves usually are pretty inexpensive. I mean, they range anywhere from $3 to $20, so really they're not expensive, but the overall setup and care and everything can get kind of expensive. So that's why I gave it a 3.7. The next category is going to be the overall care and maintenance. I rated them for my tropical. These hand motions are getting out of control. Sorry, try to ignore them. For the tropical community fish tank, my 40-gallon, I rated that a 3.5 out of 5. And the reason why is because fish tanks really are a lot of work. Like, they take so much time, so much energy. You have to maintain them a lot more than any animal that I have, at least. They just take the most time, and I have to do it the most often. Now, I will say the bigger the tank, the less maintenance you're going to have to do, so I would really recommend getting a bigger tank, which means I probably wouldn't recommend a betta. We'll get into that. For bettas overall care and maintenance, I gave them a 2 out of 5, and that is because caring for a smaller aquarium really is a lot of work. You get algae issues, they get dirty faster. That's just something to keep in mind. What's the rating I would give them for beginners? I put a 3 out of 5. I know that seems kind of crazy, but in reality, I really wouldn't recommend them for beginners. Now, I would more so recommend a larger fish tank with tropical community fish, more than I would recommend a betta, and I know that seems kind of like, that kind of contradicts what society says, but in reality, I feel like that's just a better recommendation, only because I've found that it's so much easier to care for my larger aquarium than my betta tanks. It's so much more work to care for my betta tanks. Okay, the next animal I want to talk about is leopard geckos, which is probably the most highly recommended for beginners, and I don't disagree with that. Let's get into the 4 categories. Okay, handleability. I rated geckos a 5 out of 5 in handleability, and that's because they really are so easy to hold and handle. They're very calm, they don't jump around, they don't run away usually. Again, this is really specific to your gecko, but the geckos that I have and have held, they've always been just so calm and collected, no issues whatsoever with handling. Okay, the second category is going to be costs. Now, I rated them a 4 out of 5. This is definitely, it depends. It depends on your specific situation. In my experience, if you are doing the bare minimum care requirements for leopard geckos, it can be pretty inexpensive. Now, if you're doing above and beyond those minimum requirements, it can get a little bit more expensive, but I think overall, you know, they need 3 hides. You can give them paper towels for Pete's sake, or reptile carpet for substrate. The third category, which is overall care and maintenance, I rated them a 4 out of 5 as well. They're really easy to take care of, and I think that's why they really are so recommended for beginners, is because they don't require a ton of maintenance. You don't need to do daily misting. You don't have to feed them anything crazy. You know, they don't make a huge mess in their tank. You obviously need to clean up their poop and their pee and stuff like that. Feed them every 2 or 3 days as an adult, and make sure they're getting their proper supplements and stuff like that. But overall, they're really easy to care for. And then the last category, which is how much my rating for beginners, and I'm going to give them a 4.8 out of 5 for beginners. I think that they truly are great beginner pets, but there are a couple of things that I think might make someone not want to get them, and that 0.2% that I didn't give them, I think is mostly just for the enclosure size. Personally, I truly believe that as an adult they should be in a 40-gallon, which a lot of people don't want to make the room for a 40-gallon. It's not a small tank, you know, it's that tank behind me. So like, it does need a little bit more space, and I think that that can deter someone from wanting to get one. But I think generally speaking, they're just really easy to care for. Okay, let's talk about African fat-tailed geckos while we're on the subject of geckos. So African fat-tailed geckos are not super common in the pet trade at the moment. They're getting more common, but they're not easily accessible. We'll get more into that later on. So for the starting category, handleability, I rate them a 4.5 out of 5. They're very similar to leopard geckos in their docile nature, but from what I've heard, not from personal experience, but from what I've heard, they tend to be a little bit more, I guess, finicky when it comes to handling. Sometimes they can be a little more shy and timid, so they require a little bit more work from what I've heard. From my personal experience with my juvenile, he's very calm when it comes to holding. Costs. I give them a 2 out of 5, and I know that seems crazy, but here's why. The actual setup for them is really not much more expensive than a leopard gecko. I mean, they don't have any crazy requirements. They have about the same heating requirements, maybe a little less than leopard geckos. They do have the added humidity requirements that you have to fulfill, but I mean, a spray bottle is not expensive. Now, if you want to get a misting system, that's obviously going to be more expensive, but their overall care is so similar to a leopard gecko. They're not crazy expensive. But what is expensive is the gecko itself, where leopard geckos are super common. They're like $30 to $35, pretty inexpensive for a reptile. I paid $200 for my African fat-tailed gecko, and I know some people will spend thousands of dollars or even more hundreds of dollars on reptiles, but I've never spent more than $60 on an animal, so this was crazy for me, $200. Now, the reason why is because you're not going to find them in your local chain store. You might find them in different other, you know, family-owned local pet stores or whatever, but like Petco and PetSmart, you're not going to find them there, at least not right now. So they're just more expensive, and you have to buy them online usually. And I mean, you can find cheaper ones online, but the reason why they're cheaper is because they're not captive bred. They're going to be wild caught. And I bought mine as a captive bred so I can avoid any diseases or parasites. The next category is overall care and maintenance. I rated them a 3 out of 5. There's a couple different reasons for this. I mean, their care is very similar to a leopard gecko. They eat the same food. Their heating requirements are pretty much the same. The only reason I rated them so low is because misting, the misting portion of it. I know that some people are like, that's not a big deal. But for me, living in Arizona, when we are in a very arid state, I have to mist the tank down multiple times a day to keep those humidity requirements where they need to be. I am going to invest in a misting system because it is so time consuming and I'm not home all the time, so that can get a little bit stressful. So my rating for beginners, I would give them a 3.7 out of 5. I think that they're great animals, and I think as they become more readily available, I'd recommend them more for beginners, but because of the cost of them and how difficult it is to get them, I wouldn't really recommend them for beginners for that reason. Why would you want to spend $200 on a reptile if that's your first reptile? Like, that seems kind of scary. That's a scary investment, very risky. So, and then also the whole misting thing I think can also deter you from wanting to get one. So the next animal I'm going to talk about are corn snakes. Handleability, I rated corn snakes a 3.5 out of 5. The reason why is corn snakes are pretty docile. They're not vicious by any means. The only reason why I rated them so lower is because they don't stop moving. You put them in your hands and they don't chill like a python usually will. They just go, and they have a tendency to like want to shoot out of your hand. They can just kind of be a pain to handle and grab, like getting them out of the tank. They slither around. They're just kind of crazy. They're not the greatest snake to handle. There are snakes that deal with handling a lot better, but they're also very friendly, and I mean, they're not hard to handle. It's just, it can kind of be annoying when you just kind of want to chill with your snake and they make it this huge thing. The overall care and maintenance for a corn snake, I actually gave them a 5 out of 5, and this might seem kind of crazy for a snake, but in reality, my corn snake requires the least amount of maintenance out of all of my animals, and there are many reasons why. I think first and foremost, you don't have to feed them often at all. I feed my corn snake every 10 or so days. Really easy feeding requirements. The heating requirements are very simple. The decorations, you give them a couple hides, you give them a humid hide for easy shedding, make sure they're on aspen, give them some branches and stuff to climb on. And other than that, that's really all they need. And then you clean their poop when you see it. But in reality, they're not hard to care for at all. I think that they're probably my easiest animal to care for. For costs, I give them a 3.7 out of 5. The tank itself, corn snakes do need bigger tanks as they get bigger. I started him off when he was a baby in a 20-gallon long. He quickly outgrew that. He's now in a 40-gallon. We'll see how he does in that. He might even end up outgrowing that tank. It's probably likely. So the tanks, having to upgrade them, getting the aspen and stuff that you have to change out, and the different branches and things can get kind of expensive. And then the snake itself is about $60 if you're getting like a normal morph. It just depends. It's very specific to your circumstances, but I would give it a 3.7. Okay, and the last category is rating for beginners. I give them a 4 out of 5. I think that they are great animals for a beginner. I think the only reason why I wouldn't rate them as well as a leopard gecko for beginners is because their handleability. I think that, you know, for a beginner, usually a beginner wants to handle and hold your animal. If that's not you, then it's a little bit different. But if you want to hold your animal and have an easy time doing it, especially if you're not used to handling reptiles, I don't think a corn snake is that easy of a reptile to hold. So that's why I rated them a little lower than leopard geckos. But overall, their care, in my opinion, is even easier than leopard geckos. So that's just my personal opinion. Okay, hermit crabs. Hermit crabs, there's huge debates and people have very strong feelings about hermit crabs in the pet industry, and I 100% understand people's concerns, you know, with them taking them from the wild, ripping them out of their shells. It's a horrible thing. If you want to know more about how they get hermit crabs and sort of how all of that happens, you can look at more videos about that. But I do own hermit crabs, and so I am going to talk about them. Handleability, I give them a 1 out of 5, and I think the reason why is because you really shouldn't handle them that often. I guess they're not hard to handle. You're really not supposed to handle them that much. It is stressful for them, and sometimes you can get pinched. It's not the best feeling in the world, so I wouldn't handle them a whole lot. Cost, I give them a 4 out of 5. They're not expensive to buy at all. They're like at most $6, and their tank, I would recommend a 20-gallon long or something. Not an expensive tank. You can give them eco earth or sand or a mixture of both. They need a couple hides, a saltwater and freshwater dish, a food dish, some fake plants. Overall, they're really inexpensive to have. Overall care and maintenance, I gave them a 3.5 out of 5, and that's only because they have crazy humidity requirements, like very high. They come from, I think it's the Caribbean. They need really high humidity, which can be very difficult for people to maintain. So if you're misting down the tank every single day, it can get really frustrating and time consuming. I actually have a Reptifogger hooked up to mine so that the humidity just stays where it needs to be. Overall, they're not super hard to care for, and I think the only other thing that can get a little bit challenging is their feeding requirements. They eat just about anything. They obviously have things that they can't eat. There's a huge list online of things that they can have and things that they can't have. Things are constantly changing, but they like a varied diet. My rating for beginners, I give them a 4 out of 5 because they're not hard to care for. If you're not concerned about, if you get like a Reptifogger like I did, which can kind of be expensive, but the humidity is not a huge deal, especially if you have like a glass lid. You know, just the feeding can be kind of challenging, and then the overall idea of hermit crabs in the pet trade and people not wanting you to get them. I'm not saying I recommend you go buying them, but I'm saying if you do, they're not the worst animal for a beginner. Okay, so my SD card filled up, so I'm just going to use my phone. I don't feel like going and clearing it out. It's going to take too much time. The second to last animal, we're almost done, is going to be firebelly toads. Again, not really a super common animal in the pet trade. They are relatively common, but I rarely ever see them in pet stores, if ever at all, actually. Handleability, I give them a 2 out of 5. Actually, I might even give them a 1 out of 5, 1.5 out of 5. They're really not great to handle. It depends on your specific frog, but in my experience, they are the worst to handle. With firebelly toads, you're also really not supposed to hold them, especially with your bare hands. You're supposed to use gloves. Even if you do hold them, they are a pain. They jump out of your hand, they act psycho, and they're slippery. It can be done. You just have to do it right, and then also just not that often. But I've found it to just be a pain. For costs, I gave them a 4 out of 5. The firebelly toads themselves are pretty inexpensive. I mean, I paid $25 for 3 firebelly toads. I think generally speaking, they're like $15 or $16 a piece in the stores, in pet stores or whatever. So like the animal themselves are really inexpensive. The tank, they can live in a 20-gallon tank. You want different hides and different climbing things and stuff like that, which can get kind of expensive, but I think overall, they're really inexpensive. They eat crickets. Overall care and maintenance, I give them a 3 out of 5. I think besides my fish tanks, I find myself having to clean their enclosure and just deal with them so much more than any of my other fish, or more than any of my other animals. I mean, this isn't always the case for everybody, but they do need to eat pretty often. And in my case, one of my frogs is a very picky eater and does not like to eat a lot of the times, which can get really frustrating. And then lastly, the rating for beginners, I give them a 3.5 out of 5. They're not hard animals to take care of, but they are time consuming, and I think that for a beginner, it might just be a little too frustrating, honestly. I wouldn't really recommend them. I don't know. I think if you had a little bit more experience, I'm not saying you have to be the most experienced and then I would recommend them, but I'm saying if you have like a couple reptiles and you have a little bit of experience, then maybe, and especially if you have the time. But if not, no, I wouldn't really recommend them, honestly. But I think they're great. I think they're great animals. This is just my personal experience and how I feel. And lastly, I have a Syrian hamster. Handleability, I think in general, for Syrian hamsters, it's a 4 out of 5. it really, really depends on your hamster. And I mean, really depends. My first hamster, well, I've had a lot of hamsters in my life, but as an adult, my first hamster was the best. She loved to be held. She was very easy to hold. She never bit me. She never peed on me. She never pooped on me. She was just the epitome of a perfect hamster. And then I have Muffin now, who is terrified of me, bites me all the time, hates my guts, or at least she did. I'm growing on her. She's not anywhere near as afraid of me and mean to me as she used to be, but she doesn't like to be held. I mean, like, I can try to hold her, but she wants to like nibble at me, which I'm not a fan of. But I think overall Syrian hamsters are generally really friendly. They're the friendliest in my opinion. Costs, I give them a 3.8 out of 5. Now, I think it depends on the type of enclosure that you get. We'll get into a little more with care and maintenance, but I know that PetSmart and Petco like to sell tiny little cages like this big for hamsters. No, and even those are really expensive. I use an IKEA Detolf glass bookshelf. If you watch my last video, you can see it in there, and that was about $60, which really isn't that expensive, and it's a huge enclosure for them, you know. But you also got to get the bedding, you got to get chew toys, hides, water, food bowl, a wheel. I think overall the cages for them are pretty expensive unless you build your own, then that can be kind of cheap. Overall care and maintenance, I give them a 4 out of 5. I don't find myself having to maintain her enclosure that often. I do, you know, spot clean, pick up poop when I see it, but I think overall they're really not hard to take care of. It just depends on your specific hamster. And I think also another thing is they don't live that long, which can be a downside, but also for some people that don't want a super long commitment, they're a good animal because they really only live 2 or 2.5 years. Again, it's not fun seeing your animal die, so be prepared for that. It's not a good time. But if you don't want a commitment for years and 20 freaking years, a hamster is the way to go. And lastly, my rating for beginners, I give them a 3.8 out of 5. The reason why I give them a 3.8 is because there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to animals or hamsters, I mean. People think you can put them in this tiny little enclosure and all will be well. Well, people, that's not the case. They require a ton of space, like a ton of space. And I think that's a problem for a lot of people. They don't have the room to put a freaking IKEA Detolf bookshelf on its back in their home. I understand that. A lot of people don't have that space. And so I think for that reason, that can deter people from wanting them, and parents not wanting to keep up with the maintenance of cleaning their tank, you know, at least once a month, like really cleaning it. I think I just wouldn't really recommend them for a beginner, I guess. Like I would, but it just depends on who the beginner is. Like obviously not a child. I would not recommend them to a child. But I think like if you're an adult and you've done a lot of research, then I would recommend them to you, but just be prepared that they're going to need a ton of space. And guess what, guys? That does it. That wraps it up. I'm really glad I got to film that video for you guys today. I hope that it was informative and that it gave you guys a little bit more information. So maybe if you want to buy one of these animals, you have a bit of a better idea on if it's the right fit for you. Like this video if you did enjoy it, and I hope you guys have a fabulous day. Okay, see you guys in my next one. Bye.